So today we'll talk about war, oil, and trade restrictions, as Jerome said, and we'll really focus on, even though these are global events, the implication of these events for Australia. And I'm much more excited to hear from our panelists today than I am to hear from myself. So we have three great specialists here through Pina, Hiti, and Michael, who Jerome will introduce in much more detail later on. So let's just kind of cast our minds back to earlier this year, and if this wants to work, whoops, which it doesn't. I'll see if I can point. But if we just focus in on the top left, then we'll see up here, it's a map of the Middle East and the Gulf, and there's this little circle that is present, which most of you probably know what that is by now because it's become somewhat infamous, which is this Strait of Hormuz. So from memory, this is a strait which goes from Oman up until Iran, where you can see there. It's about 170 kilometers wide. But what people, well, you might know because of what's been reported, there are a lot of commodities that transit through this Gulf, and it really connects all of these Gulf countries with the rest of the world. So we have, for example, 1/5 of the world's oil supply that currently passes through there. We have about half of the world's supply of sulfur, which is a key input into fertiliser, which is my understanding, and Hiti can tell us much more about that later on. We also have about 1/3 of methanol and helium, and I learned that helium is not only for balloons and making our voices squeaky, but it's also a key input into things in medicine like MRI machines, which I didn't know about before, and it's also used in the production of chips, which is helping fuel our AI boom around the world. So this, extends not only to oil, but to other commodities which are very important. And one fact that people might not know is that even though this strait is about 170 kilometers wide, it's very, very shallow. And only 3 kilometers of that strait can be used for these ships to transit through. I hope I've got my facts right. Yeah. So basically what that means is if someone wants to put a blockade in for whatever reason, it's pretty easy to do. 3 kilometers is not very far, right? You could walk that in about 30 minutes. You could clearly see from one side to another. And if you just place a couple of mines across it, you've basically said no one's allowed to go through that region anymore. And this is not something that's new. In fact, people have known this for at least 600 years. So when I was doing some reading, you read back and you see that the Portuguese once realized that a lot of the world's spices came from this region. And rather than going and conquering that region, they realized all you need to do is control the strait. You control the strait, you control the trade, you can collect the gold, right? And then the Brits realized that with the East India Company, they came along, kicked out the Portuguese, and then we get to the modern day, where on the 28th of February, US and Israel decided to launch Operation Epic Fury on Iran for reasons that at least were stated to be nothing to do with this particular Gulf. But, the US has turned out to be a pretty big net beneficiary from the region, so you can take what you will from that. And as we'll see, there are major issues for that for the rest of the world. So about 80% of Asia's, as you can see from this map up here on the top right, fuel supply, oil supply, I should say, literally comes from this strait. And when the missiles started to strike, we see a dramatic drop. On average, about 129 ships pass through this strait, after which only 6 pass through this strait. And most of those are through Iranian waters from China. Yeah. So there's been massive, massive decline. And a big part of the reason for this is not only because of this war, it's because the insurance companies said there's a war going on. We're no longer insuring ships going through that channel. So if you want to take on $100 to $250 million gamble as to whether your ship will get through there safely, that is up to you. Yeah. We'll circle back to that because it's going to be, I think, an under-talked about point in this war, but probably from what the rest of us know, this has had direct implications for oil prices. They've skyrocketed. They've somewhat plateaued since, but as we'll see later on, I think it's a bit artificial. So basically what I want to spend most of the time talking about is the macroeconomic transmission of what we call these shocks, these events that have taken place into Australia, right? And I'll break it down into 4 components. Number 1, we'll look at energy and fuel. which we're probably all familiar with. We'll have a look at that, how that transmits into prices and activity through the value chain, of which we have experts here. We'll then talk a little bit about my research, which is to do with expectations and uncertainty and how that can have very real effects, and also the policy implications and what can and can't be done, why the RBA is jacking up these interest rates and making us all pay more money on our mortgages, and what fiscal policy can actually do to try and fix this. All right, so channel one. Often when people think about oil prices, their mind goes to energy. And this is true for a lot of countries around the world. It's not so important for Australia. So if we have a quick look up here in the top left, you'll see that the total primary energy mix for all uses of energy around Australia is actually predominantly fueled by oil. And that's why early on, we saw a lot of these headlines which were saying that the war in the Middle East is going to have catastrophic impacts on Australian energy markets. But then, definitions matter. If you look a little bit closer into the actual electricity generation mix, then oil is very small. It's pretty much down the bottom. Will this work? Maybe. That's oil, right? We can see there's been a big reduction in coal over the past couple of decades, and we're seeing this massive increase in renewables. So the main channel through which this transmits is not electricity. We can see from the bottom figure that the main channel is actually transport, right? And then industry, from which we have some experts here, and shipping make up the bulk. Less than 1% of Australia's electricity mix is actually coming from oil itself. So then this raises a key question. If oil is used in fuel for logistical reasons, then where does Australia's fuel actually come from, right? It's a natural question that you might be wondering. And you've probably seen this on the news as well, which is that in the early 2000s, Australia was pretty much self-sufficient. We were able to take in oil and refine it more or less fully domestically. And then due to the creation of these so-called massive, what's the word I'm looking for? Massive, efficient refineries that were built throughout Asia, companies within Australia quickly discovered that it was no longer economically efficient to keep operating those refineries within Australia. It's actually cheaper to let the refining happen in Asia and import it in, right? So from an economic efficiency argument, that makes sense. We don't need these refineries anymore. Let's shut them down. So we've closed 6 of 8 of those refineries. And then over time, as we can see in 2025, so this is a couple of months before the war in the Middle East started, Australia was 80% reliant on imports to get total fuel. So the only 2 refineries we have left are in Geelong, and I believe it's Lytton, although I'm not from Queensland, so correct me if I'm wrong with the pronunciation, right? One thing that people might not know, and this is something that I've certainly learned over the past year, and I know Hitzi's an expert in, is that 3 of the major fertiliser plants within Australia have also closed since 2019, and this hasn't made much news, probably because people were preoccupied with the pandemic that was going on and other things. But this, to me at least, is one of the major issues, because 85% of our fertiliser is now imported, 60% of which came from the Middle East. So this is a massive shock, which will have effects over the next year, as we'll see. So for these reasons, some people in the media have come up with this term, which I quite like. It's called Diesel Nation, when they refer to Australia. And we can see from these charts again, I'm a stats guy, I love charts. I hope it's not overkill for people. But up in the top, a fun fact that you might want to leave tonight with is that Australia is the world's largest consumption per capita country of anywhere in the world. So we use the most diesel per person. That's what that means, which to me at least was pretty surprising, because when I think of kind of car usage, I think US for whatever reason, that's what comes to my mind. But Australia blows that out of the water. And then when you think about it, it's like, yeah, we have a really big country. We need to get things around the country through supply chains, right? We need trucks, we need ships. It's no wonder that we actually consume a lot of diesel. We're also the #1 importer of diesel as well, and most of that is used through the transportation, mining, and agricultural sectors. And that's why, as we all know, earlier this year, after the war broke out, when we went to fill up at the Bowser, we started paying a lot more money for fuel. It's not only diesel, right? It's also unleaded as well. We see this massive spike that has occurred here. We saw pretty much a run on the Bowser, if you would call it that, where people were taking big tanks and trying to fill them up. Anthony Albanese and others came out and said, please don't do that. It's not COVID, right? We're not going to run out of toilet paper. We have plenty of fuel. They said we have about a month's supply at that stage from memory, and that's something we'll come back to. I said that this has declined, as you can see, in recent periods, but we know that this is somewhat artificial. It's artificial for a couple of reasons. Number one, if we look at the actual cost mix, then we can see that a big proportion of this in the green there is taxes. And what's happened in recent periods? That's been halved, right? So you can add another 26 cents per litre to a lot of this to get something that's a bit more realistic. And another thing that we'll also see is that the International Energy Agency released the largest quantity of strategic petroleum reserves in history to try and get that price down. And that's a short-term fix, right? There are some solutions that are being proposed, most of which people won't like, but we'll get to those in a bit. So it's not only fuel where we all feel this pinch, it's because fuel impacts the whole value chain, of which we have some experts here, and Pina will hopefully tell us a bit about farming a bit later on. So if we start from the front end, which Michael's an expert in, well, we need to have oil from somewhere. How do we get it? We import it. When we import it, then that's going to add to freight charges. It's also going to go to farmers to be able to produce crops. It's going to impact all types of vehicles and everything that's going to be used within the farming process. They then load up food, for example, onto the back of cold trucks so that perishable goods don't disintegrate, right? They don't go bad in a short amount of time. And that's the cold chain. So again, this requires energy, packaging. Well, petrol is used in plastics and other products. When I was overseas earlier this year, they were telling me that medical costs are skyrocketing in some countries throughout Southeast Asia because of plastics, right? So anyway, and then of course that needs to be taken to the supermarkets where we buy the food from, and then that will add a retail price on top of that. So this is sometimes what we call the inflation pass-through of an oil price shock, where we start with something on the left-hand side, it goes up the value chain and eventually results into higher prices for all of us in not only food, but other goods and services. So as an economist, we like to keep things simple. And if you've taken managerial economics here, which I'm sure most of you have since you're alum, then you'll probably have seen a demand and supply diagram that looks something like this. And because we're in macro, we call it an aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram, or ADAS for shorts. And basically what this says is, well, if we start at A with some equilibrium, price and quantity, in this case we have price, we can think of that as inflation, and quantity as total GDP, for example, then we get this shock, commodity price shock, as we just saw, is going to increase the price of goods and services generally. It's also going to push down the quantity of those things that are available. And we get what's called a stagflationary environment, which is every policymaker's worst nightmare. You know? Part of the reason it's the policymaker's worst nightmare is because a lot of our policy objectives, even if you date back to the work of Keynes in the early 1900s, have been about managing demand side. And we'll see later on that monetary policy is fundamentally a demand side policy. Most fiscal policies are fundamentally demand side policies. How do you fix a supply side problem? Well, you have to fix the supply side problem. That's the only way you can actually do it. You can't just help people and then expect things to get better, okay? So there are real trade-offs that we're going to see when we get into the policy space. So this is not just a theoretical situation. If we look here, then we can see that inflation has started to tick up, as everyone is well aware of, and we've seen interest rates rise as a result. One thing that might be a little bit surprising is that output is also growing, although at a much slower rate than is expected. And that's partly and I don't want to say this is the full story, but it's partly because Australia is a lucky country, as I'm sure we've all heard before. We're the major beneficiaries of exporting other commodities, and even though the resource boom is certainly over, as we can see here, it's plateaued over the past decade or so, we're still benefiting somewhat from higher LNG prices, but primarily up from the top there, you can see stronger exchange rates and higher terms of trade, which means that we basically get more money for our exports than we do for our imports, and we benefit from that. I'll give some perspective, because I know people are hurting, I'm hurting, but it is worse if you go out there into the world. Within a month of the war in the Middle East, Philippines declared a state of national emergency. They had power outages. They had people lining up to get fuel because of fuel shortages. They've had increases in inflation. They've also had underemployment at a 3-year high. And this is because 98%, as you can see there, of their oil, 97% of gas, which is used in energy creation there, comes from that region. So that's just got cut off overnight. So within a month, they're not doing so well. And we can see that other countries around the world are also facing similar challenges. You know, if we look here, Japan has seen a spike in food prices, staples like rice doubling. So, you know, what was once just a problem of oil not being able to pass through a strait in the Middle East has turned to some people not being able to drive, some people not being able to eat. So these effects are very real. I think one area that doesn't get near enough attention is actually, what about the Gulf countries themselves, right? They've been completely cut off, yeah? So if we think about some of those countries from that initial slide, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, etc., well, these countries have now lost all access to tourism. Most of their food supplies came through the straits, and they're reliant primarily on desalination plants for water. And the major threat is, if you get involved in this war, we'll just strike out those desal plants, right? It's not a good situation for anyone to be in, yeah? Okay. So part of my research is not only looking at the effects of physical supply shocks and their economic effects, as you can see on the top, but also looking at uncertainty that is associated with these types of massive disruptions and those type of flow-on effects. And that can be very important because uncertainty can hit even without any changes in supply, right? And those effects can be very real. In fact, typically what we'll see when people are talking, like OPEC releases some kind of news, even if the government comes out, they describe some kind of new policy, there'll be a lot of uncertainty associated with that, and people will just act in order to hedge themselves against that in the future. And uncertainty can drive the business cycle. So I really love this quote, which you might leave here with, which is from Olivier Blanchard, a very well-known economist in the US. So he says, given uncertainty, why build a new plant, introduce a new product? Better to pause until the smoke clears. And I'm sure that's something that all of you can relate to in today's business environment, even here within Australia. There's a lot of uncertainty that's going on. People, businesses, I should say, have made layoffs. We have an AI boom. There's a lot of uncertainty about how that's going to take place. How long is this war actually going to hold out for, etc. So this is a classic real options channel. I've also done a bit of work on precautionary savings, which simply say, well, even as households, I'm sure if we look around, people start to build buffer stocks of savings, right? Because you want to hedge against the future. If we do end up in a recession next year, I want to make sure that I'm in a position where I can kind of smooth myself over that particular period of time. I don't want to have to default on my mortgage, right? Anyway. So we don't have to look too far to see the impacts of this. So if I pull up consumer sentiment index, we can see here it's currently at a pretty much 2-decade low within Australia. And you just have to open the newspaper to kind of see the effects that are happening through uncertainty around the country. A couple of Fin Review articles there talking about fuel shortages and driving up the prices of food, as well as electricity prices, although I think that one's probably a bit overstated, and recession risk, which is a very real possibility over the next 12 months. So what can the government do about it? right? The government's job is basically to look at all of this uncertainty, look at these negative shocks that we're all being hit with, and try and come up with a plan that can steer us on a better course for the future, right? We don't want to run off a cliff. But as I said before, part of the challenge with this type of environment is that, especially in the monetary policy arena, the RBA only sets the cash rate. So they have a demand side policy, which is ultimately to change interest rates. And on the fiscal side, they can do a lot, as we'll see. They can, lower taxes temporarily. They can provide some subsidies, but they can give some transfers, but these are short-term fixes, right? They can't keep these things on indefinitely. So really it comes down to these supply side type deals, and these are questions that I'm going to pose to our great panel about what's actually being done in this space on the ground, right? So I'll give some overview. There are other international government agencies that also can kick in and help. Like I said, the IEA has released the world's largest of emergency oil reserves, but they're dwindling. We'll see. Actually, I took it out, but the US strategic petroleum reserves are currently at the lowest they've ever been since 1983. So you might know that in the 1970s, we had an energy crisis not too dissimilar from this one due to wars in the Middle East. In particular, Iraq was at war with Iran, and then people in OPEC were kind of misbehaving. So the Saudis came in and said, okay, if you're not going to meet your quotas, then no one will. And yeah, it was a bit of a mess, right? After that, people established these reserves, yeah? Unfortunately, as we'll see, not everyone has played along, but they're also just a finite resource. We can't depend on them too much. So what can monetary policy do? Well, as I said before, the RBA's job, and I hope if you are from the RBA, you'll forgive me for just giving it this briefly, but their job, more or less, is to keep inflation within a 2 to 3% range over the medium term. They do a lot more stuff, financial stability and everything else, but I'm simplifying here, right? And how do they do that? Well, they change the cash rate. They change the interest rates, which for us kind of feels like an unfair thing for them to do, because it just means that we'll be forking out more of our paychecks into our mortgages, mostly speaking, probably given the audience in this room. But there are other channels through which this operates. It's obviously going to impact the cost of borrowing in firms and also in households. And the RBA does this to meet what I call the Goldilocks zone, right? So, on the one hand, if inflation is too high for too long, right, things are running a bit too hot, then they're going to have to increase the cash rate to try and reduce the economic activity and bring down inflation. It's a classic demand side story. If the porridge is too cold, right, then we're on this side where they're reducing the cash rate. They're trying to heat it up. They're trying to get more spending flowing. And then if the porridge is just right, you can eat. Yeah, they're not going to change anything within the cash rate and the economy, generally speaking. So we can put that on our figure. So previously we were at this equilibrium B, and now the RBA's come in and they've said, well, inflation's going to be too high for too long. So what we're going to do is increase the cash rate, and that's going to cause a monetary contraction, which pushes us down to this new equilibrium in C, which, if I drew the P's, you would see actually brings the price down. But what's the cost? The cost is that this comes at an even lower output, right? So that's why when you read the news, a lot of the time they'll say that Michelle Bullock and others at the RBA are walking this fine line between pushing Australia into an economic recession and keeping stable inflation. So you might even think, well, why do they do that? Why not just let inflation run free, right? Surely that's going to be better for society than me herding through these cash rate changes. And evidence or history has shown that that's just actually not the case, right? So why do we actually have this 2 to 3% target? This is a target range which is deemed to be an acceptable rate of economic growth, roughly speaking, that will translate to, there's this one fun fact called the rule of 70. I don't have a pen on me, but if you went 70 divided by the growth rate, it would take approximately that much time for something to double in size. So at 2% inflation, 70 divided by 2, it would take about 35 years for prices to double. And if prices doubled every 35 years, we'd probably be happy. Yeah, so that's what they're trying to achieve through that lower bound. Now, what happens if prices were 7% or 10%? Well, if they're 10%, as they were in this post-pandemic inflation surge, and they're essentially doubling every 7 years. Now we're not so happy, all right? In some parts of the world, prices have doubled since February. They're really not happy, right? Okay. What about fiscal policy? Can we do anything better here? Well, we can. We can start to provide targeted relief, especially to those vulnerable households that need it. So we don't have to impose blanket tax reductions, blanket subsidies. We can actually target industries. We can do a lot of things. We can also strengthen fuel security, which is something that's happening, and invest in supply chain resilience, which is also something that's happening. But as we'll potentially hear later on, these things might take time, right? And in the short run, it's going to still have an effect. Unfortunately, the government doesn't have a magic wand. They cannot control global oil prices. It's completely out of their control. You know, we saw in the media today that new strikes have occurred, even though there were talks of peace deals not so long ago. So we would expect maybe for this to run for a bit longer than expected. They also can't fully offset any of these trade-offs that we've talked about. So what have they done? Well, on the demand side, we know that they've cut the fuel excise. They've done temporary, just complete eliminations of other taxes, for example, on heavy road usage, which is good for logistics companies, and also on ag for the next 12 months. On the supply side, they've pledged $15 billion approximately to try and create fuel resistance for Australia. So about half of that is going on fuel and fertiliser facilities, which, as we saw, were just eliminated. So this is kind of undoing some of the actions over the past, 6 years to 20 years, right? They're also pledging quite a chunk of money, $3.2 billion in a fuel security reserve, which is about 1 billion litres of diesel and jet fuel, which is something that Michael might be able to tell us more about, although I don't want to push people in directions that they certainly can't talk about. And they've also invested in trying to get Australia off of fossil fuels, as we all know, into cleaner alternatives. Okay. So the macroeconomics of fiscal policy, we can see here, number one is that, well, previously we saw monetary policy pushes us this way on the diagram, fiscal stimulus on the demand side pushes us that way. So this comes with the idea of trying to offset this output collapse, right? That's the whole goal there. But usually what happens is it just leads to higher inflation. And even if they come in and just said, well, you know what, let's just put price caps on all of these things. So we want to get rid of that inflation. Then what would happen? Well, we get non-price rationing, which is essentially people lining up halfway around the block in order to get their fuel. As soon as the service station runs out of fuel, you're out of luck. Go to the next one. And we saw some of that unfolding earlier this year. I can remember one time when I went to fill up, no petrol, right? That particular station was out. My stepdad works in a service station. He was out of work for a couple of weeks out of the month because they literally just didn't have the supply chains to get there and refill the tanks. So the better policy, if we can have it, is to push this supply curve back to where it was. That would offset everything. But this is somewhat limited in what the government can do because we can't just go out and get more oil. All right, we can't just go out and get more fuel. That's why Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong earlier this year were in Southeast Asia, striking a lot of these trade deals with places like Korea, Singapore, and Malaysia, which is where we get most of this oil from. Okay. So what's the outlook? It's been a bit of a pessimistic talk, right? When I was talking to one of our people in marketing, Bree, who's great, she helps me with a lot of these comms. She says, Jamie, this is really depressing. Do we have a more positive outlook? I'm sorry, right? It's the best I can offer. So what does the RBA say? Just to let you know that it's not fully coming from me, yeah? So this is the RBA's forecast from the most recent statement of monetary policy. And they basically give this baseline, which is here in the kind of pink. They then give an adverse scenario, which is in green, and another adverse scenario, which is here in orange. And the baseline scenario was that Hormuz would reopen, right? And most central banks have pretty similar forecasts. So this is not just unique to the RBA, I should say. So their idea was that the war would end and Hormuz would be fully open by the end of the year. Yeah, this was the best case scenario. And under this scenario, we can see that they would say, well, inflation will kind of peak and then get back within the target range, and unemployment would go up by a bit. Yeah, and remember they have to accept that trade-off in order to be able to meet their inflation targets. So what are the adverse scenarios? Well, adverse scenario one is that there's a little bit of an extended situation that's happening in the Middle East. This is only to Q1 27, so it's not looking so far away, right? And under that scenario, we can see that inflation would be higher because of some stickiness, and unemployment would be higher. And then essentially what they do is they have an even worse scenario where unemployment would be up around 5.1%. So regardless of where you look, best case scenario, we're kind of headed for a little bit of a dip. Worst case scenario, we're headed for a pretty big increase in unemployment, which is typically associated with a reduction in output. But I think there are two under-discussed risks, and this is what I'm more excited to learn about from our panel, if I'm being honest, which is, well, number one, even if the war magically stopped today, right, which would be great, everyone would be happy, it doesn't just go back to business as usual, right? And that's because the Strait, as I said before, was actually littered with mines throughout this whole process, right? So the Pentagon has estimated that it would take about 6 months to clear the straits of mines. And as I also mentioned earlier, the insurance companies probably will not reinstate that insurance on a $100 to $250 million tanker until that's cleared, right? So there are really unknown delays, yeah, in terms of how long this would take, 6 months, 12 months, who knows? In terms of fertilizer shortages, which is the one I'm probably most concerned about, if I'm being honest, then, fertilizer, we can see from over here, fertilizer prices have skyrocketed. They're the highest they've been since the Russia-Ukraine war. And the UN has also come out and warned that there's a very real chance of food crises within the next 12 months. So I hope the government's thinking about this. They've pledged some money, and I'm looking forward to hearing from our panel. One thing that I should have said before I'll get the panel up here is that part of the reason we're also in this challenging situation, as Michael would know all too well, is that, I hope I didn't cut this out. Yeah, here, I should have said, Australia is part of this International Energy Agency. So part of this is that it requires the member countries to maintain at least 90 days of net oil, right, in accordance with their rules. But Australia hasn't met this since 2012, right? We've usually had 30, 40 days throughout this period, is my understanding, which is part of the reason we can't smooth a lot of these effects out, like China, for example, if you follow what's happening there. They have the 90 days. They also accept oil from Russia, which they're now passing on to Southeast Asia. And we obviously get that through trade. So even though we have embargoes, we do actually get through the process Russian oil. Okay. Hope it's not too depressing. I feel like I needed some more fun in that. But anyway, I'm really excited. We don't have images. Do we have images? No? Let's flick back to the start. We did. Something happened. Yeah, we'll see them now. Anyway, I'm very excited to hear from our guests. So I'll let Jerome do the formal introductions. There we go.
So I will invite our panel members on stage, and I'll introduce them. So first, we have Pina Palumbieri, Chief Operating Officer at Dairy Australia. Pina joined Dairy Australia in 2023 and became Chief Operating Officer earlier this year. She brings more than 20 years of leadership experience across retail, food manufacturing, and the broader supply chain. Before that, she held senior strategy roles and transformation roles at Coles Online, Kraft Heinz, PZ Cousins, and General Mills. She's also an MBS alum, Executive MBA 2018, and received the Dean's Award for Global Business Economics. She's spoken about how the MBA has helped her lead complex organizational change during the COVID-19 pandemic. The next panelist is Michael Baker, General Manager of Australia and New Zealand Midstream Infrastructure at BP. He has more than 20 years of experience across the energy industry and has held leadership roles in ExxonMobil, Gemini and BP, working across upstream, midstream, and downstream operations. His expertise spans engineering, operations, supply and strategy, including emerging areas such as biomethane production. He's known for bringing together technical and commercial thinking to deliver practical and sustainable infrastructure solutions. He completed his part-time MBA in 2014. And then finally, Hiti Taluja. Hiti is a commodities trading and supply chain strategist with more than 20 years of international experience in trade, bulk shipping, and procurement. She was Chief Commercial Officer at ASX-listed Centrex Limited and Regional Manager at the global commodity trader Tremo. She can give us a unique perspective on how oil price shocks and supply chain disruptions affect freight and fertilizer and food production. She's also a fellow of the Chartered Shipbrokers in London and now works as a consultant to fertilizer and chemical companies in the region. And she completed her executive MBA alongside Pina in 2018. So, ladies and gentlemen, please give the panel a warm round of applause.
Seats. Make some space. This one. Oops. Okay. So, who wants to go first and give a more positive spin on it? No. I'm extremely excited to hear what each of the panelists have to say. So, if you don't mind, Hiti, I'll kick things off with you. Yeah. And because fertilizer is something that, as I mentioned at the end, I'm quite concerned about, but I don't hear any discussion of this in the Australia media. I do hear discussions of this in the international media, and especially if I look at places like the UN and the IMF and et cetera. So what are the implications of this for Australia specifically, as opposed to the world in general? And, you know, is there a bit too much hype in the talk, or does it have some grounding in reality?
Yeah, I don't think it's a hype, you know. There is a compounded structural changes which has happened in Australia. The first important one is since 2019, which you also mentioned in your slide, is closure of 3 major fertilizer plants in Australia. And one was doing urea and ammonium sulfate. The two were the SSP, which is single superphosphate, very much required for the pasture industry here. So after those closure of that plants, what has happened is we are importing fertilizer into Australia. But obviously, it all compounded when Straits of Hormuz got, we could not bring product from there, where I would say Australia imports close to 1 million ton of urea, out of which I would say 80% of that urea comes from those Gulf region. And the reason is the supply concentration, because the grass prices are so low in that region as compared to here. That is the reason it's cheap to buy product from there. And that's where if you see just recently, you would have seen that the Australian government actually subsidized 3 main companies to bring urea at a subsidized rate. So they are going to provide some subsidies to these companies so that the prices can be stable. So I definitely don't see hype. We might not see price increase in our food cycles now, but when the new application season comes in, that's where all those inputs will go. So currently the food or the crop which we are enjoying right now is based on the prices from the previous application, where Correct. So we will see in probably next 2 seasons that the prices hike will go up. The real price hike recently has only gone up because of the fuel increased prices, not actually the input costs. But we will feel that in next 6 to 12 months for sure.
Okay. And then I might just pass on to you, Pina, and build off of that if it's okay with you in relation to the dairy industry in talking about the direct impacts of fertiliser prices and oil prices more generally, if we're only seeing those priced in at the moment and not yet the fertiliser prices.
Yeah, Hayley's absolutely right about that in terms of the outlook. I mean, so we start with the positive. You wanted some optimism.
Sure.
We've had a lot of rain, so everybody's really happy about that. It's been a really good autumn for particularly the southern dairying regions of Australia in, Tasmania and Southwest Vic and northern Victoria. But to Hayley's point in terms of seasonality, urea supply into the spring will be critical to just ensuring that pasture levels reach, optimised and in an affordable way for farmers so that they're not absorbing additional costs as, at the start of the food supply chain, because then that could be quite, problematic going forward into the future seasons, as Hayley pointed out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And can I ask, so I'm a bit of an amateur when it comes to exactly how the fertiliser prices are used. Urea, which industries is primarily impacted?
So plants need, just in a layman's language, plant needs 3 nutrients. N, nitrogen, which comes from urea. P is phosphate, which is your MAP, DAP, those kind, SSP. So phosphate builds all the bones of the plants and also helps with the animal bone building as well. And then K is mostly the potash, But we're not that much impacted with regards to potash because most of the potash for Australia and New Zealand comes from Canada and US. So that's not, but having said that, potash only beautifies the animals or the plants, but the main 2 ingredients are your nitrogen and phosphate. So, I have seen that. So apart from that, there are also other based apart from urea, which provides nitrogen, to the plants.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I wasn't sure if I didn't know that. But I hope that's also shed some light. So if I switch gears a little bit, Michael, and I understand, you might be restricted with what you can and can't say. One thing that I was very shocked to learn about earlier this year was that Australia has kind of hit its targets of this 90-day requirement. And it probably came as a shock to many people around with having these 30 to, 40 days potentially. So do you know much about that? Can you talk much about that?
Yeah. Share some thoughts.
Yeah, please.
Switch it up. Thanks very much.
You mentioned the IEA have a target of 90 days and Australia's been hovering around that 30 days across all the different grades, diesel, jet and gasoline. And your questions leading to the why. Why can't we have more and why are we hovering around this? I think it comes down to a few factors. One is risk. The world's changing. These crises didn't happen in 2012 earlier, and the government was rolling the dice that they won't happen. So we're going to hover around that 30-day mark and make that decision. Building more infrastructure is very capital intensive, and these tanks just don't sprout out of the ground, even as urea was in there helping to grow. But they take 2.5 years to build a tank, so there's quite a bit of a lead time on those. I think the other thing is the industry pre-Middle East crisis, it was all about efficiency and optimization. So it was about having stable, balanced supply chains. Now, post that, it's all about resilience. And so that's why the conversation is now moving to, okay, we do need to invest some money and build that resilience and start moving away from an efficiency optimized mindset.
Yeah, okay. I mean, the economist in me loves the just-in-time inventory system, right? Loves efficiency, but I can completely understand in other times it's better to have some kind of plan for stability, right? With definitely within the outlook. So in terms of what Australia currently has, is there anything that you think, and it's coming just from a personal perspective, I suppose, could be done to strengthen that resilience within the petroleum sector in general?
Yeah, I think it can be broken down into two areas. One is the supply chains offshore and how do we get it here? And previously, there was a very stable supply chain. You mentioned the refineries in Asia supplying Australia. Moving forward, how do we grow the resilience there? It's a very interconnected world. We've now established new supply chains post the Middle East crisis. So how do we strengthen those and make sure we've got diverse supply chains coming into the country? And then the second area is obviously where do you put it?
Yeah.
And so we have tanks and pipes scattered all around the country, and there's an opportunity there to build more. And that goes to the packages that you mentioned and some of the billions of dollars that the government's looking at to provide that storage, ullage and capacity on site to meet those minimum stock obligations of increase the number of days of service.
And what kind of lag are we looking at? 1 year, 2 years, 5 years in terms of building some of these? So I guess these are massive tanks, right? And the oil needs to be stored within them. They've got to go somewhere, right? You need to construct them.
Yeah, they're pretty agricultural actually. Like you think they're high tech or anything, but it is just a bunch of steel welded together and big tanks. Having said that, though, they still need to be designed correctly. There's a lot of regulations to comply with. And I just mentioned earlier, it's about 2.5 years to build a tank. When you go through the whole design process, development approvals, materials, construction commissioning. Having said that, there'll be a big focus on it. How can we streamline that, get efficiencies? If you're building one tank, build 10 tanks. Right. So there's certainly opportunities there to reduce that lead time.
That makes a lot of sense. And Hiti, if I ask kind of a similar question, but just in the fertiliser sector in general, does Australia even have a national program on that front?
Unfortunately, Australia do not have any reserve program. Okay. So if you see other economies in the world, for example, if you see India, right? India have got their reserves because they're also very dependent into importing fertilizer. But they also provide subsidies to importers to bring in fertilizer, whereas Australia has got no policy whatsoever when it comes to the reserve. And secondly, I think more important for Australia is to keep whatever plants are left, which are very old, right? Keep running them and not close them, subsidize those companies, help them to survive, but then add more capacity. So they are some of the projects which are coming in the market. But unfortunately, with fertilizer or even with microspace as well, a lot of private company, and I've experienced that in some of my past career life, is you want to do some of these big projects, but you don't these days get a resilient investor who's happy to invest in projects, wait until 5 years or 4 years, and then they get their return, on their investment. And that's where it is important for government to jump in to become as an investor, being resilient to establish those hubs, So not only it will create more domestic capacity in the market, but also I think it will help to build that skill set among the population as well. And one other point which I also want to mention is that government should also target, and you talked about as well in your slide, is give subsidy to target farmers or industry, so not a blanket subsidy, but figure out that which sector of agriculture need that kind of subsidy and provide that to the farmers so that farmers don't shut their farms, and I'll pass, I think, to Pina to expand more on this. There's so many farmers now shutting down their farms because they are in that myth. I don't know. Do you feel that?
Yeah, I mean, there certainly has been a reduction in dairy milk supply from 11 billion litres now to just over 8 billion litres. But and one of the key things is that farmers and ongoing sustainable, profitability and when we talk about shocks and resilience, how much can the supply chain absorb from a cost shock point of view and for how long? And that's one of the key challenges. But the government has certainly stepped in very, very quickly to collaborate with industry and work through what the demand is, and particularly with regards to regional allocations to make sure that the stocks and supplies were in the right regions and in the right volumes relative to where the ag sector production is. Obviously, there's lots of challenges as you move across the supply chain with the processes needing to move from town to town and cover quite a lot of kilometres and mileage. And that is a unique situation for Australia, which is why you do see the diesel per capita just being so high. And all of that just continues to feed into the overall value chain and the cost implications there, which as an economy and consumers don't really have the capacity to absorb that additional cost.
Yeah, I think everyone's feeling the pinch at the moment, right? Especially coming off the back of the pandemic and the cost of living associated with some of that.
Yeah, most definitely. And from an ag sector perspective, they're very accustomed to responding to shocks to the system, particularly with, with floods and droughts. And now the fertiliser fuel. And so there is a really strong infrastructure in terms of how government and industry work together to respond in the ag sector. But that doesn't necessarily alleviate cost pressures coming through this.
Mm-hmm. So I guess if I throw a question just out in general, since everyone here is an alumni of MBS, and I'm sure leading businesses from the front in terms of management across a variety of industries, what advice would you give to people in that situation about the outlook and how they can navigate kind of a year of uncertainty, if anything? I know it's a challenging question. Do you have any words of wisdom?
Talking about words of wisdom and some words.
Yeah.
We've noticed that the conversation about energy particulars moved from like the operations frontline to the boardroom. It's getting that elevation right now. It's all about moving from that optimization to the resilience piece. I think going forward, what boards and companies and executives need to consider is testing the assumptions that they've used for their risk assessment scenarios. Their business continuity plans, are they correct? The likelihood of these global crises seems to be increasing. We never thought we'd have a pandemic. We've had multiple wars, Ukraine, Middle East, what's around the corner. The frequency seems to be increasing. So by testing the underlying assumptions of your businesses, or if you have risk assessments, business continuity plans, that's probably the first place, and then testing those robustness, because they drive your actions and what you're going to do.
Yeah, great advice. And in fact, there was a speech, I'm not sure how much people follow the RBA media, but Sarah Hunter gave a talk yesterday on demand and supply shocks and the frequency for Australia, stating that supply shocks are becoming more and more prevalent, as we've all seen over the past 5 years, and she expects that they'll pick up even more so into the future. So it's certainly something to think about in terms of the risk assessments. So thanks for that. Do you want to add anything on top of that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll pass it over.
What I have seen lately is with farmers in a lot of company is the shift, and the only advice I can say is agronomic advisory, which is like you don't need to put so much of fertilizer in your soil, go for a proper advice as to how much amount of fertilizer is needed to do that. But besides that, what has happened, and I've seen the shift in the market, is that you're seeing a lot of new companies coming up with different biofertilizer space. I'm seeing a lot of experiment being done in the chicken poo space, with fertilizers, cow dung space, and also using a lot of biostimulant. I had one of the companies that recently came to me, and what they're using these so whatever is the leftover in the fire extinguisher, right? They take that because it's got some kind of ammonium sulfate. They're trying to granulate with some organics and then produce a fertilizer. Now, again, so recycling, upcycling what we currently have. And my only advice is to government is to encourage, and provide those subsidy to those companies, who are trying to come very innovative in that space to give that nutrient back to the soil.
Okay, that's great.
There's definitely a lot of innovation that continues to happen in the ag sector, and situations like this certainly stimulate that even further. From a shock response perspective, having been in e-commerce when COVID broke out and now in the ag sector during the fertiliser fuel crisis, one of the things that has really stood out to me is in the business continuity plans, you don't wait for these types of situations to play out to get your playbook up to speed. Organisations definitely want to be simulating this across various scenarios in their supply chain. Who in the organisation is on point? How do industries connect? Who's got the direct line with government? And how does this play out and across supply chain point of view? It's definitely something that organisations would want to be increasingly getting the playbook up to date, making sure everyone's clear on who's on point. People come and go within organisations, but how ready are companies to pivot when these types of situations unfold? Because hours are costly, days are costly, and it can take time to set these things up. And you don't want to be working out if you're ready when you need to be ready. You definitely want to be having that plan well and truly laid out prior to even hopefully ever needing it.
I think that's great advice. Risk, risk, risk.